Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're opening up a really fascinating investigative file. We're talking about one of history's most debated objects, the Shroud of Turin. So here's the big question, right? Is this an authentic holy relic, or is it a masterful, absolutely brilliant medieval forgery? You know, for centuries, this single piece of cloth has inspired so much faith and, at the same time, so much controversy. So what we're going to do is look at what the evidence laid out in our source material actually says.
Okay, so what we find when we dig into the sources is that the case isn't built on just one thing. It's really this powerful convergence of different independent lines of inquiry, all pointing in the same direction. Let's start with the first line of evidence, which is the historical record itself, because that's where the questions really begin to pop up.
So first up, a suspicious historical record. Yeah, the Shroud's own history is our first exhibit. And you'll see it doesn't really begin in ancient times, but smack in the middle of a very controversial era.
Okay, look at this timeline. What's absolutely fascinating here is the massive gap at the beginning. I mean, a complete void in the historical record from the 1st to the 13th century. Think about that for a second. For an object that's supposed to be the burial shroud of Christ, there's just nothing for over 1,300 years. Then, boom, it just appears out of nowhere in France in the 1350s. And what's more, it immediately starts drawing heavy skepticism from major church figures.
And this quote really drives the point home. This is the official stance at the time. So what happened was, a bishop, Pierre d'Archy, he formally reports this thing as a fake to the Pope. And the Pope doesn't exactly rush to embrace it. Just the opposite, really. The church's official ruling was, okay, if you're going to show this thing to people, you have to announce that it's a copy, a representation, not the real deal.
All right, so that's the history. Now let's move on to our next piece of evidence and see what happens when modern science gets involved in this debate.
And this is really the cornerstone of the whole critique. In 1988, the Shroud was finally subjected to the gold standard for dating ancient stuff, radiocarbon testing. I mean, this was the moment everyone was waiting for, a chance to get a definitive, scientific answer once and for all.
And here are the results. The tests, with 95% confidence, place the origin of the cloth somewhere between 1260 and 1390 CE, right smack in the Middle Ages. And what do you know? That finding just happens to align perfectly with when it first showed up in the historical record in France.
And you know, this wasn't just one test from one lab. They did this the right way. They sent samples to 3 totally independent, world-class laboratories. One in Arizona, one at Oxford, and one in Zurich. And guess what? They all came back with the exact same medieval date range. That kind of powerful consensus is hard to argue with, and it was all published in the super prestigious journal Nature.
So of course, people who believe it's authentic pushed back. They've offered up theories to try and explain away this date. You hear things like, oh, the sample must have been from a medieval patch, or what about bacteria contamination skewing the results? But honestly, these ideas are pretty fringe in the scientific community. They just don't hold up. For example, to get a 1st century date to look like a 14th century one from contamination, you would need a weight of bacteria almost twice the weight of the shroud itself. It's just not plausible. And standard testing procedures already account for this stuff anyway. Okay, so if it's a medieval creation, that begs the question, how on earth did they make it? The image is famously mysterious, right? Well, it turns out forensic analysis actually gives us a surprisingly clear answer.
This is where the work of a brilliant microscopist, Dr. Walter Macron, comes in. His analysis was groundbreaking because it showed the image isn't made of some mysterious, unexplainable substance. He looked at it under a microscope and found billions of tiny little particles of paint. Specifically, red ochre and vermilion pigment in a collagen temper medium, which, you guessed it, is basically a standard paint recipe for a 14th century artist. He even concluded the so-called bloodstains were also just paint.
But you might be asking, what about that weird photonegative quality of the image? That's the real mystery, isn't it? Well, recent digital analysis has a pretty compelling answer. It turns out if you just drape a cloth over a real 3-dimensional body, the image gets super distorted and warped, like a funhouse mirror. It doesn't look like the shroud at all. But if you press the cloth onto a shallow sculpture, a bas-relief, you get that smooth, almost photographic quality that we see on the shroud. It completely avoids the distortion. And then you've got the figure itself, which, well, it has some problems. The proportions are just impossible. Critics point out these unnaturally long arms, a really tiny forehead, and then there's the blood. The blood flows on the hair defy gravity. They run as if the person were standing bolt upright, not lying down. All of these features are actually really consistent with the artistic style of Gothic art from that period, not so much with a real human body.
Okay, but let's be fair.
What about the evidence that people cite to prove the shroud is authentic? Our sources dig into these pro-authenticity claims too, so let's take a minute and see how they really hold up under the microscope.
So you've probably heard about the pollen claim, right? The idea that pollen from plants only found in the Middle East proves the shroud's origin. Well, it turns out that claim is based almost entirely on the work of one single, pretty controversial researcher. His methods were unrepeatable, and more importantly, he just didn't account for the most obvious thing. An object that's been handled for centuries by countless people is going to get contaminated with pollen from, well, everywhere.
It's a similar story with the blood claim. People say the stains are type AB human blood. But again, those claims are based on some really outdated tests. Modern science shows us that certain bacteria can actually create false positives for AB blood type. And maybe the biggest piece of evidence here, recent DNA analysis found genetic material from multiple people, from a bunch of different ethnic backgrounds all over the shroud. It's a clear case of widespread contamination, not blood from a single person.
And finally, let's talk about the weave of the cloth itself. The argument goes that the complex herringbone pattern is a sign of a really valuable first-century cloth. But here's the thing, that's just inconsistent with what archaeologists have actually found. The real burial cloths we have from that time and place all use a much simpler plain weave. There are just no known examples of a herringbone weave from that era.
So when you take a step back and look at the whole picture, it's not just one thing that casts doubt on the shroud. It's this powerful convergence of evidence we talked about at the beginning. You got the historical record, or lack thereof. You have the hard science of radiocarbon dating from 3 different labs. You have the forensic analysis showing paint pigments, and you have the artistic analysis of the body's proportions. They are all separate lines of inquiry, and they all point to the same conclusion, a 14th century origin.
So we come back to our original question, a priceless holy relic or a masterpiece of medieval ingenuity? Based on the extensive analysis in our sources, the evidence really seems to suggest that the Shroud of Turin is a testament not to a first-century miracle, but to the incredible, jaw-dropping skill and artistry of the Middle Ages. And that leaves us with a final thought. What changes if we start to see it not as a relic, but as a different kind of miracle, a masterpiece of human creativity? That's a question worth pondering.